Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to King's for those from outside King's. I'm Nick Butler from the Policy Institute here. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all. This is the first of a series of 5 lectures by Dominique Moisi under the title of What Went Wrong. And Dominique, for those of you who don't know him or read him in the Financial Times or so many other papers from around the world, he is the founder, senior advisor at IFRI, the French Institute of International Affairs. He's professor at Sciences Po, and he's I'm delighted to say, the visiting professor here in the Department of Political Economy, and the author, since he doesn't think in small terms, as you'll hear, of a fine book which I recommend called The Geopolitics of Emotion, which I've no doubt he'll refer to during these talks. He's going to talk tonight to give an introduction to those under the title of What Went Wrong, the World in 2015. Dominique.
Thank you very much. Well, this is my 3rd lecture series, and if you look at the titles, there's a sense of growing doom and gloom. I started relatively positively on the West in the Asian century, then went to the title of The Triumph of Fear, and now I am on What Went Wrong. But I don't want to depress you too much, and you will see in the course of the series that I will try to find reasons for hope beyond the reasons to worry. Well, if you look back 25 years ago, the 1990s were starting, and there was some kind of feeling of elation. And I just read the other day a long piece on the 1990s. Oh, good they were. In fact, when you read the piece, you had the feeling of someone writing about La Belle Époque, the years preceding World War I, or even the years preceding the French Revolution, which were described as la douceur de vivre, the sweetness of living. And when you look at periods like that, the 1990s, what defines the positive impression they leave on people? Is it the starting point? The fall of the Berlin Wall, the seemingly triumphant arrival of democracy as the universal winning model? Or is it, by contrast, not the starting point, but the end point? The 1990s ended tragically with 9/11. And this is always a question which you have to ask yourself in historical terms. In fact, if you look back to the 1990s, they look to me as a kind of precious parenthesis. I was 25 years younger, and at all levels, things seemed to work well. In fact, too well. If you look at the origins of the financial disorder that led to the crash in 2007, you have to go back to the 1990s. And the feeling then that the sky was the limit, that two-digit growth was normal, two-digit returns was the new pattern. Democracy had triumphed. Even peace in the Middle East seemed to be around the corner. You had the Madrid Agreement, you had the Oslo peace process, and there is still the lingering feeling that if only Rabin had not been assassinated in 1995, peace could have been achieved. In those years, there was also the feeling that the euro would have a spillover effect from the economic side to the political side. I remember my debates with my British friends. Some of them were optimistic, a few. A majority was probably more skeptical or cynical. They did not believe it would work, but it was Britain. From Germany to France, from France to Italy, there was the feeling that the euro was going to open the way to a new Europe, an enlarged Europe that would be a deepened Europe at the same time. If I remember also the end of the 1990s, conversation I had with Richard Holbrooke, there was the feeling that the reality of power, the United States, and the symbol of law, the United Nations, were about to come together, to create new rules, to launch a new order. Was America first, of course, but it was America in the name of a new multilateralism. Of course, if you go back to the 1990s, that decade was far from being perfect. The moment the wall fell, war returned to Europe with a vengeance. Raymond Aron had described the period of the Cold War as the period where peace was impossible, but war improbable. And suddenly peace was possible, but war less improbable than before. You just had to look to the Balkans and to see what was happening to Europeans. And of course, it was not only the war in Europe that shocked us in the 1990s, it was ethnic cleansing in Central Africa. The worst bloodshed in history since Cambodia was taking place in this so-called happy decade. But nevertheless, there was something positive, even if we could sense that there were problems looming in the horizon, in particular in Russia, where a sense of confusion and humiliation was rising. And analysts were wondering how long would Russia remain silently and patiently in the wings, passively frustrated. There were other negative things, of course, in the 1990s, like the collapse of Argentina, which had huge economic consequences for the country. But what followed was so much worse. And it started in the very beginning of the 21st century with the second Intifada that preceded by a short period of time, of course, 9/11. And what we are witnessing now, since 9/11, seems to have been totally negative. After the good 90s, you had the bad last 15 years. They started badly, and they seem to be moving constantly in the wrong direction. Of course, there was a sense of a short and hopeful parenthesis, starting at the end of 2010, called the Arab Spring, but with the possible exception of Tunisia. There's a feeling that the Arab Springs, which is probably more fair as an expression, has been going in the wrong direction. And people are speaking of the winter of fundamentalism replacing the Arab Spring. In fact, all the dates that came since 2000 seem to be going in the wrong direction. And it's quite interesting to see that the commemoration we have been going through in the past years are all perceived as warnings that we are on the wrong path. What are those commemorations? The first one, of course, is the centenary of the beginning of World War I. Is war around the corner? And in fact, Asians looked with fascination at this commemoration. The number of books sold in Tokyo or in Beijing on the origins of World War I has been impressive, as if they thought, or we thought, that 2013, 2014 in Asia could be the equivalent of 1913, 1914 in Europe. And then, of course, there was World War II. And what followed World War II, i.e. the Cold War. And the Cold War seems to be coming back with a vengeance. And not in Asia, but in Europe, right where it started, right where it was, with the feeling that the differences between the Soviet Union then and Russia today are significant, but probably for the worse and not for the best. Yes, Russia doesn't have the power the Soviet Union had, but Russia adds to a revisionist ambition a sense of humiliation linked to the 1990s, which did not exist in the triumphant Soviet Union that came out after World War II. And since we are evoking historical dates, it's quite striking, frightening to say that 2 weeks before the commemoration of the liberation of the Auschwitz camp on January 2015, well, Jews were still killed in Paris because they were Jews. And so there is that feeling that all the dates that we can evoke can be used as warning in the most negative sense of the word. So what went wrong? How can you try to explain the fact that fear has triumphed, to use the title of my last year series? I think if you start to look for a reason, the most important one is the sense of loss of control of men over events. The image that comes to mind could be as follows. We are in a plane, the turbulence are extremely rough, and there is a sense that there is no pilot in the plane, or at least not a competent, reassuring one. A pilot who could explain to us what is it that we seek to prevent, or what is it we seek to achieve. And so there is that sense, which I think is at the very heart of the malaise we are going through, that we are living through exceptional circumstances with, on the whole, no exceptional leaders at the helm. I think this feeling of loss of control of man over events is, of course, also linked to our difficulty to make a hierarchy, a pecking order of the threats confronting us. We all see the diversity, the simultaneity of the challenges we are faced with. But it's very difficult for us to decide what is the most challenging one, what is the most difficult one, what is the most urgent one. If you remember, there was a book written about the Cold War at the end of the Cold War by a French journalist who was the head of Le Monde, André Fontaine, who wrote a book called One Bed for Two Dreams. And he spoke about the unity of the world in the Cold War and the diverging dreams of the capitalist and the communist. But today, we are clearly in the same boat, but we have diverging nightmares. Even Europeans are deeply divided about their nightmare, and they are divided along geographic, historical, cultural lines. If you live in the east, in the center, or in the north of Europe, you would probably tend to be more obsessed with Putin than with ISIS, Daesh. If you live in the south of Europe, it would probably be the reverse. Putin looks far away and the terrorist so close. So some people would say, we don't have to choose, because we can't. We have to face those two threats simultaneously and find a way to apply the right recipes to their particularities. But some people would go further and would say, well, yes, there is Putin and its revisionist ambition. Yes, there is Daesh, or in a way, the consequences for the Western world of the war that is raging within the world of Islam, and the consequences we are paying from that war, which we are part of, because terrorism has not found only in Europe a target, but a breeding ground. What strikes us most is not the fact that terrorists are striking at Europe, but that terrorists were born in Europe and are Europeans. It's our lost children. And in that case, the question, what went wrong, is not only what went wrong, but what have we done wrong? And, of course, it covers matters which are extremely diverse and which will be the topic of one special lecture I'm going to give. But basically, that kind of interrogation about the difficulty to create a hierarchy amongst the threat challenging us leads to a third interrogation. And if the main threat was not coming from the outside, but was coming from the inside, and not only for us in the West, but for the emerging powers, for, in fact, all countries in the world. The dysfunctioning of American politics in America and its consequences for the United States' role in the world, the identity crisis in Europe leading to the rise of populism and the challenges to the models we have been proud of defending and assuming in the world. So there is that sense that, in a way, we don't know. We have never lived, or at least that is the impression we have, in a period characterized by so much simultaneous uncertainty. The Cold War had a reassuring simplicity. You had two blocks, two sets of ideas, and rules of the game, the balance of terror, which were well understood by the two key actors, the United States and the Soviet Union. Today, there is a sense that there are no rules, that no one plays by the rules because no one knows what the rules are or have become. When the writer and producer of the extraordinarily successful television series Downton Abbey tries to explain to his audience why he is so successful, he has a very interesting remark. And he says, well, I think by the end of the day, they are reassured to be taken into a world where there are rules, and where rules do play a role in the life of individuals, be they upstairs or downstairs. And yes, it is the exact opposite of the world we seem to be living in. Let me try to cover very briefly the themes I'm going to look at during this year. What went wrong with the United States? How could you challenge the idea of the American dream when the man who is the President of the United States for the last 6-7 years is in himself the incarnation of the American dream? And in that case, you have to say that the dysfunctioning of the American political system, combined with the rise of inequalities, create a sense that the system has to be reformed in the most urgent manner. Francis Fukuyama has been speaking for years of the triumph of vetocracy over democracy. But it is only one part of the problem. The other part of the problem is, of course, the fact that the qualities you need to get elected seem to be in contradiction with the qualities you need to govern. That plays for the United States, but I would say it plays for all democratic systems on the two sides of the Atlantic. And I think Thomas Piketty, in his bestseller, Capitalism in the 21st Century, touched something very right and very deep when he says that the rise of inequalities has reached a point when it threatens the very functioning of capitalism. And so you have an America legitimately obsessed with herself and coming out very fatigued of two adventures in the Middle East, which left her with a sense of, I won't do it again. And of course, this is in part balanced by the fact that America is becoming independent in energy terms, which gives a further incentive not to get too involved in the affairs of the world. But it is I think, at the very heart of the problem I'm trying to describe. There is no referee. There is no empire or umpire. There is a sense that no one is in charge, and that we are left alone. Precisely because the unipolar moment of the United States, which really existed between 1990 and 2000, has not been replaced by something else. And we are in this moment of transition between two systems where the old system no longer works and where no new system is coming to replace it, with the emerging countries neither ready nor willing to play a positive role. Some of them are abstaining, like China and India. Some of them play a nuisance value simply in order to exist in their own eyes and in the eyes of the world, and that is, of course, Russia. If you move to the Middle East, and the feeling of threat for the world emerging from that region, I think 4 words come to mind. The first one is fragmentation. The Middle East is exploding in front of us. The artificial boundaries created by us at the beginning of the 20th century will be very difficult to re-establish. In fact, they are challenged precisely because those boundaries are our children, illegitimate children in the eyes of those who challenge them. The Sykes-Picot Agreement I directly attacked precisely because we wrote those lines in the sand. The second word, which I think comes to mind when we speak of the Middle East, is the word radicalization. We're back to a purely religious dimension within the world of Islam and between the world of Islam and the non-Islamic world. Execution of 25 Christian Copts in Egypt, of Egypt, in Libya. Declaration of war on Jews. It's very interesting that the places that are attacked in Europe by jihadists are not Israeli consulate or Israeli official places, but Jewish places, which get us back to the origins of the conflict that existed before. There's a third word which I think comes to mind when looking at the Middle East, and it is, of course, the word expansion, as if the Middle East had ceased to be a geographic place, but was nearly becoming a state of mind. And this is, of course, an impression that feeds on the fears of the West. I just read with, I must say, absolute fascination, the latest novel of Michel Houellebecq, French writer, who's the bestseller now in France, Germany, and Italy for his latest novel, Submission. And he writes about the state of France in 2022 as the new president has been elected and is, of course, a Muslim. And all French political parties voted for him because he was the only alternative to Marine Le Pen and the National Front. It is, of course, an absolute provocation, but it's a provocation that touches on something very real, very deep, and which is the fear of a Europe being, in his case, voluntarily Islamized for reasons which are very much linked to the evolution of the country. And he describes a man who is asked either to retire, but he's in his 40s, that's the hero of the novel, or if he wants to continue to teach at the University of Paris-Sorbonne, who has been bought by Saudi Arabia, he has to convert to Islam. And if he does so, of course, he will be entitled to 3 wives and will be paid 3 times what he gets right now. And you can imagine the choice that the hero of the book is going to make. But when we are confronted with such a challenge as the rise of jihadis, Salafis, whatever, and I'll come back to it later in the course, but what do we have to do? I think 3 things. The first one, not to underestimate the threat. We didn't see ISIS coming at all. We were caught by surprise. Second, don't overreact. This is precisely what they are expecting us to do. They want us to repeat, so to speak, the Patriot Act, as America did, with quite negative results. They want us to create a sense of total alienation between the Muslims and the non-Muslim. And if we agree that there is a war within the world of Islam, to overreact is precisely making sure that all of Islam will come against us. It is losing the moderates, which are still on our side. It is paving the way for the clash of civilization that Samuel Huntington spoke of in as early as 1993 in his first article in Foreign Affairs. And the third point, which I think is very important, after do not underestimate the threat, do not overreact to the threat, the third point, which I think is fundamental, is do not overestimate the threat either. I think personally that for Europe, right now, Putin is much more dangerous than Daesh. Daesh may transform us for the worse, but Putin may completely change the rules of the game in Europe by making acceptable that boundaries are changeable by force, and that the rule of the strongest will prevail over the weakest. And so it is essential, I believe, to have that kind of clarity in our approach to the challenges that are facing us. And I look at the watch, I'll finish in 5 minutes. I think in the Jewish tradition, there is a word called tikkun olam, changing the world for the best, repairing the world because it's broken and you have to mend it. And I think it's very important at this point to keep reasons for hope, to see that our model, even if it doesn't work as well as it should, still make people dream. No one dreams of becoming Chinese. No one dreams of becoming Indian. There are thousands of people that are risking their lives to join Europe. There are thousands of people that are still looking at America as the model. I mean, you have young people in Europe whose life gets a meaning by killing other individuals and being killed. But you have thousands of Chinese in Hong Kong that are also on the other side, willing to risk their life for the sake of a model in which they still believe in deeply. And the threat of Daesh can be containable. It's a cycle. It's a cycle of madness which exists for very deep reasons, which we have encouraged, but it can be contained. And the cards of Putin are, by the end of the day, less good than ours, as long as we are united and believe in ourselves. So, in a way, when I dedicate that first series to what went wrong, what I have in mind is also what can go better and how to make sure that this moment of doom and gloom remains a parenthesis too, and not the direction in which we are doomed to go. I should stop here to let time to questions.
Dominique, thank you very much. Very few people I know could cover so many topics in 45 minutes, including Downton Abbey, which I know Dominique knows is the way that England still runs.
And America.
And America. We have 20 minutes or so for questions, which Dominique has very kindly agreed to take. Can people identify themselves, please, and can they be brief, so we get in as many as possible? Who would like to start? Gentleman at the top corner. Yes.
This gentleman here.
Sure.
Charles Rose. To what extent do you think that the issues which have emerged since the year 2000, during the 90s and subsequently, are about the celebration of events like the fall of the Berlin Wall, but without there being, and the Arab Spring, without there being a clear plan and a set of resources invested to make sure that these events were transitional in a positive way.
Mm.
Gentleman here.
Ahmed Shibani from Libya. I usually describe myself as a leading cyber rebel and the founder of the first secular political party in Libya called the Democratic Party. We feel abandoned because we saw the Arab Spring as a spark for change, for a positive change, because I feel you've touched the head on you hit the nail on the head. But we felt that the United States of America lacked leadership in our region, where we have enough and fed up with the old Arab order and the religious establishment. We wanted to carve a new path of secularism from Islam within. Sadly, to no avail. And now we have a serious ideological vacuum in our region which gave birth to discourses such as ISIS. The question is, when will the West have a position? Because we see France is very happy to sign a €6 billion deal with Egypt to supply them with Rafale. On the other hand, dictatorship is still flourishing. So rather than supporting the old Arab order, why we are not left to our own devices to find our own path?
Thank you. Take one more and then lady at the back. Joe.
Joanna Kidd from the Policy Institute. You said at the end that there were reasons to be optimistic if the United States and Europe stayed together and still believed in themselves. Do you think the leaders of Europe and the United States do still believe in their systems?
Why don't I take the questions in reverse order? Yes, I think they do. I really think they do. It's not always obvious. In fact, when you speak to business leaders of the world, they tend today to hint at Europe as a kind of re-emerging power. What do they say? They say, well, euro went down, the price of oil went down. There are objective reasons for breathing space. There is a slight return of growth. But above all, it's the rest that doesn't work that well. Europe, to these big leaders, seems like a lesser risk. They want to return investing in Europe. It's not to say that they are abandoning Asia or they are disregarding Africa's demographic explosion. But they're back to Europe saying, well, we expected the worst has not come, there are mild reasons to be optimistic, and by the end of the day, it's the safest system. And I think leaders of the Western world know that. Of course, there are people who never believed in Europe and are confirmed in their most negative vision of Europe by what's happening in Europe. The rise of populism. But again, when you look at the Greek crisis, you can look at the negative side, they're never going to reach a compromise, or you can look at the positive side, Portuguese and Irish giving lessons of citizenry and courage to the Greek. We worked hard and it worked for us. Why can't it work for you? So I think it would be premature to say that Western leaders have abandoned faith in their system. They're looking at the rest of the world and they say, well, by the end of the day, it's not that bad where we are. There are even people rediscovering Poland, saying, well, it's a place by the end of the day where things are going much, much better than we thought they would go. To your question on the West and Libya, and above all the West and the hope of Arab democracy. Well, it's a very problematic issue. We are revealing ourselves with a zapping temperament. We switch interest and emphasis like a zapper would switch television programs. A few years ago, the most important thing was to save Benghazi from Colonel Gaddafi violent instinct. And we did that. But then, of course, we said, well, we did it. And we left. In fact, it's a pattern that repeats itself. Right after 9/11, we go to Afghanistan. But we satisfy ourselves with pacifying Kabul and the region around Kabul. And then we go to war in Iraq. It's much more interesting to overthrow Saddam Hussein. And we abandoned Pakistan. And we left the two situations unfinished. And today, what are we saying? Well, we've been dreaming of helping democracy setting up in the Arab world. But honestly, it was a dream. The only country we could manage, because it was so small, because it was so open to the West, was Tunisia. So we concentrated all our energy on Tunisia. But look, Egypt, the middle empire of the Arab world, the center of the Arab world, it's nearly 100 million people. It's always going to be bankrupt. We let Mubarak down. Then we supported Morsi because he came through democracy. And then when Morsi proved himself to be incompetent and intolerant, we were not that displeased by the counter-revolutionary process that led to his dismissal. And now we are with Sisi, which of course is much worse than Mubarak, but the situation has become so much worse as a result of all these processes. And we don't want to go back on the ground, boots on the ground. Look what happened in Afghanistan, look what happened in Iraq, would be a very bad idea. So there's something that seems to be working. We find boots on the grounds which are of a regional nature, and we support them from the air. The Kurds in Syria, the Shiite in Iraq, we rearmed them, and why not the Egyptian, the Algerian, and the Jordanian? Of course, in democratic terms, you may have something to say about the nature of the Egyptian regime, the nature of the Algerian regime, a little less about Jordan, which is by the end of the day, not a democracy, but a relatively enlightened, despotic, monarchical regime. And we help them. We help them with our defense budget. We pay for them. And if need be, we bomb the places they are attacking. Isn't it a war among Islamists, among the world of Islam? So we are helping not the good, but the moderates. And in fact, it's exactly what Saudi Arabia and Egypt was telling us. It's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. They told us we are the last bulwark against terrorists. But in fact, they were not only bulwark against terrorism, they were the cause for terrorism. The despotism, the brutality, the corruption led to the creation of Daesh. And so it's a full vicious circle. We back where we were. And I'm not going to lie to you. We made a mess of it all. To put it bluntly and as simply as possible. I'm sorry, could you in one word repeat your first question, because I put it in reverse order, so I forgot you. I'm terribly sorry. Could you just in one word remind me of your question?
I'll take a couple more as well.
And you take a couple more, yeah.
I want to know whether under-resourcing after major events is a significant part of this failure which you've just so eloquently described.
Okay, I'll take a couple more and then let Dominique finish. John? Yes. There, please.
Well, I've been trying to think of something positive to contribute. And I think I found something. It doesn't sound wholly positive. And the question is, do you agree with this? That after the period of the 90s and before the current apparent real crisis, you could say that Europe was irrelevant. That Europe was so preoccupied with its internal organisation, contemplating its navel so intensely that it seemed incapable of looking up and contributing to the solution of various growing international problems. Some, like the Balkans, flaring up, and it took an awful lot to lift it by its collar and stick its nose in that bowl. But today, I would argue, and this is the positive thing, that Europe has become intensely relevant. Now in crisis, it seems to me that if Europe gets through its current preoccupation with Greece and with other internal problems, as well as it may, then it would then become the self-confident bath plug which prevents all the bath water draining away, as it seems to be in your analysis. Imagine a Europe that was as self-confident as you wish it to be. Wouldn't the world suddenly look much different?
I'll take one more. The lady, yes, the second row, but yes.
The gentleman here.
I can't take too many more, really. Maybe I'll
Maybe take him.
take you. That lady.
Hi. So you discussed the sense of a loss of control of people over events, and that how people are feeling that there are no exceptional leaders in the world today. I was just wondering what kind of leadership you're suggesting to ameliorate this situation, as it seems as though nations are growing tired of U.S.'s interventions abroad. The U.S.'s policy is kind of or status as the world police. Are you suggesting that the United States needs to kind of revamp this leadership, or are you suggesting that somebody else needs to kind of take the lead on this?
I'm going to be very generous and let this gentleman here have one quick question, and then you have 5 minutes.
I can speak loudly. You touched briefly on... Sandy Johnson from the Ministry of Defence. You touched briefly on Thomas Piketty and his concern that the rise of inequality was beginning to threaten capitalism, or would sooner or later threaten capitalism. Would you agree with him that that was one of the things that went wrong? And if you do agree with him, where would you rank that as a risk in relation to Putin and Daesh?
Yeah.
You have the last word.
Trying to answer all questions. Have we underfunded the hope stemming from the good things? Probably. But by the end of the day, I don't think one should be too negative about what we did in the 1990s. In fact, if I had to emphasize the disillusion side, I would go to the last meeting of President Clinton with his closest advisor. And it was described to me by a person who was there. And Clinton had been president for 2 mandates and was moving out of the White House, and said, well, I had a unique opportunity to change the international system. I had means no American president had before me, if simply because the Soviet Union was no longer there, and I was clearly alone in my category of power. And for some reasons, I realized that too late, and when I realized that, other things came to block me. And I think this kind of candid confidence by Clinton stayed in my mind as an interpretation of what went wrong, what could have been and was not. On your positive remark on Europe, yes, I would buy that, totally. I'm very struck by the change of the attitude of the world towards Europe. A few months ago, Europe was considered as simply irrelevant. And suddenly, it is back to be the first line of defense against Putin's ambition and Daesh ambition. And we've never been for such a long time at the center stage. Yesterday we thought of ourselves as a model, and very few of us as an actor. Suddenly we are a target, and we want to be an actor in the game that has made of us a target, while remaining a model. This is the challenge. On leadership, I'm not trying to reinvent a world where America would lead and the rest would follow. I think this is no longer to be the case, but a world in which rules of the game are reintroduced accepted and explained. I think what we need most is a kind of pedagogical clarity, whereas in the democratic world we've had so much demagogic populism. People have not been explained very clearly. Those two questions, which Kissinger asks in his last book on power, when he says, what is we should be striving for, what is we should prevent mostly. On Piketty, and that will be my last point, I mean, Piketty at one point in his book has the terrible irony of the United States is that it has become a land of inheritors. Wealth is inherited, whereas it was the land of opportunity. Well, the fact that 1% of Americans are owning 30% of America makes the social contract barely impossible to survive. I mean, in 1973, the difference between the highest paid salary in a firm in America and the lowest paid salary was between 40-1. It was between 401 in 2007, and it's probably 600-1 today. So it's simply a rise that is challenging the basis of a democratic system. I mean, it's the absolute contradiction with the American dream. Can I just read one thing, and very quickly, if I find it. The man who created the expression "the American dream" is called James Truslow Adams. And in 1931, in The Epic of America, he described the American dream as the dream of a better, richer, happier life for all of citizens of every rank. Well, that's clearly that's not corresponding to the state of America today. And Barack Obama, in his speech to the nation in 2014, said, "We betrayed our American dream." I'm sorry, I've been a bit too long.
That's fine. Thank you very much. We must close now. Can I thank everybody for coming? The next two lectures in this series are on the 16th and 24th of March here, so I hope you will all come back. The next one will be on what went wrong
with Europe.
And I hope also on picking up John's point, what else we can do to turn what went wrong into an opportunity and more positive as well. Can I thank everybody for coming? I'm sorry I couldn't take all the questions, and particularly thank Dominique Moisi for giving us such a provocative and excellent lecture. Thank you very much.